Excellent. All right. Welcome, everyone. Give everyone just a moment to enter. Great. Welcome, everyone, to the third session in Prime's Accreditation and Ranking Impact webinar series. My name is Sophie Konski, and I am the Manager of Programs and Engagement here at Prime, or the Principles for Responsible Management Education. This series responds to a growing shift across business and management education, a renewed focus on societal impact, sustainability, and responsible leadership as key components of accreditation and ranking standards. So thank you again for being with us today. Please do make use of the chat function or the dedicated Q&A function to engage with the panelists and our team. We'll be sure to keep an eye on that, and we welcome all of your contributions. For this episode in our series, we're joined by collaborators in this space, Financial Times, to unpack the evolving landscape of higher education rankings. As institutions navigate an increasingly complex landscape shaped by global crises, sustainability challenges, and shifting societal expectations, ranking bodies like FT are adapting to emphasize more than academic reputation and research output. We now see a growing focus on societal impact, the integration of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the cultivation of skills for responsible leadership. In today's session, we will explore how institutions can better align with these evolving expectations using tools like Prime's Sharing Information on Progress report, or the SIP report. That framework as a pathway to demonstrate credibility and commitment. We can discuss practical strategies, share institutional experiences, and unpack how engagement with Prime can support visibility and performance in rankings. Our expert panel today includes voices from Financial Times, of course, the Prime Secretariat team, and a member of the Prime community who bring firsthand experience in ranking and impact reporting. So once again, we look forward to your participation and questions as we examine how business schools can harness the power of responsible management education to not only meet ranking criteria, but meaningfully contribute to a more sustainable and just world. So today we're honored to have with us Andrew, Matt, and Meredith, who I would like to invite to kindly introduce themselves. Meredith, you're first on my screen here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks for having me. I'm Dr. Meredith Storey. I am a PhD in Business Education for Sustainable Development, formerly of the Prime community, and then I transitioned through the ranks through the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Networks and into the UN Global Compact. With the LEGO grant, actually. So that was when we began our pedagogical work, which has grown into content development, curriculum, pedagogy, research, and professional development. And now here with you, Sophie, with the community side of things too. So thank you.
For being with us. Matt, you're next on my screen here. If you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Sophie. And hi, everyone. So Matt Gitsham, I'm a professor of business and sustainability based at Hult International Business School. So we're a global business school with campuses in Boston, San Francisco, London, and Dubai, doing management education, postgraduate degrees, undergraduate business degrees, and then also corporate education and leadership development based out of our Ashridge campus, also in the UK. So I'm UK based, but I have faculty colleagues across all those campuses teaching, but also I'm the academic director of our Sustainability Impact Lab, which is a home that supports faculty across our campuses doing research around sustainability in ESG topics. And I also help coordinate the work we're doing around ESG in the curriculum and how that connects with rankings and accreditation and everything else.
Excellent, thank you. And a very early joiner to Prime. All right, Andrew, over to you.
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks for the invite. So I'm Andrew Jack. I'm the Global Education Editor at the Financial Times. And so a big part of my work deals with, of course, business education. And within that, I've been a big advocate of what we've called responsible business education. So we can talk about, of course, our rankings, where we've tried to inject relevant elements into what we do. But as I always say, of course, there's a lot more that we do besides rankings and things that are more complex to measure. And so we also have, as you'll know, annual Responsible Business Education Awards for business school research, teaching, and student activities. We also have a series of mini case studies and professor picks and other initiatives around integrating issues of sustainability and responsible management for our readers, leveraging FT content. So look forward very much to our discussion today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation. Andrew, you'll remember 2 years ago at our global forum, we had a roundtable with you and colleagues around Financial Times, kind of what was happening in the space too. So excited to bring insights from that and see kind of where we've come since then. But maybe before we get started, Andrew, if I could just pass it back to you really quickly, and if you could dive a little bit more into the history and the context around the Financial Times rankings, kind of how long has it been around, how long have you been leading this work, and what is it that you specifically seek to measure?
Yes, well, to be clear, the FT has a core rankings team of data analysts and statisticians, 3 internal and a couple of external consultants. We started ranking MBAs more than 20 years ago, and that franchise, if you like, has expanded to embrace something like 7 or 8 different business qualifications, master's level programs, as well as executive education, non-degree training courses. I've been involved for the past 6 years or so, and a key area I've been looking at is how we can inject and measure more around responsibility and sustainability in what we do. So we can talk about the details, but we've been looking at ways to assess sustainability relevant work in research, which is one area that we rank in a number of our rankings, in teaching, and also the wider operations and activities of business schools.
Excellent, thank you. And I know you also look at things like kind of community and practitioner engagement as well. So thanks so much for sharing that. And Matt, maybe I'll kind of come over to you and look a little bit maybe for some more context from your experience kind of on the ground and in the community and kind of the day-to-day. So you have experience with ranking criteria, of course, from this internal perspective. Could you describe your role a little bit more within Hult and what external stakeholder priorities drive your own priorities?
Sure, yeah. I guess so. I think in your question around what stakeholder priorities are driving our priorities, I guess you're talking around sustainability and responsible management specifically. Yeah, great question. I think there's lots of different factors that play into why we as a school are interested in prioritizing responsible leadership and sustainability and ESG across our work as a school, and the work we do in our curriculum and the work with students. There's lots of starting points. I guess one would be our own sense of purpose as a school, and we have a purpose statement around doing the work we do in order to help people make an impact that matters. And so that's a starting point for most of our conversations around sustainability and responsible leadership. We're also interested in providing an educational experience for students and today's and tomorrow's business leaders that helps them navigate the world, and these issues around sustainability, ESG, are core to what organizations are having to face and navigate one way or another. So it's part of being a world-class business school. These are things you ought to be talking about. So it's the right thing to do. It's important for the world. We know that students are interested in these questions. People are coming, they're asking questions. They want to know what we're doing on our curriculum. So we're also a service provider, and we're meeting market demands. And then on top of all of that, there's other kinds of stakeholders too, like accreditors, like the rankings bodies. And so there's lots of reasons why these topics are important and they're high on our agenda. But I think I would say that it helps that accreditors and ranking bodies are asking these questions as well. There's always lots of things that all schools are trying to prioritize, and lots of different things competing for attention, and every little bit helps in getting something to the top of the agenda. And yeah, I've seen a real difference since the FT started asking these questions. Yeah,
really great point, and something that came up in our previous episodes too, that what gets measured gets done too. So it's definitely it's definitely a welcome kind of positive pressure, let's say. So Meredith, maybe I'll turn it over to you. You lead the work on content development and community here at Prime. So how do you perceive the role of rankings among signatories, and how does that play a role in the vision of Prime?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think originally when I started off with my introduction, I mentioned the Sustainable Development Solutions Network just for the differentiation factor of being in the UN. You cannot rate or rank, and that's like a very fundamental part of the DNA that we exist to empower, to create those opportunities, and to recognize the pressures that the business schools and the universities are facing. I think Matt spoke very nicely to it. It was a very large question, but just to say that like the stakeholder pressures can feel quite overwhelming in the amount of time and quality work that needs to go into evidencing things, that the evidencing process takes a long time, but the things that demonstrate the evidence are even deeper in roots. So with Prime, what we hope to do is to create the opportunities for those roots to grow so that when it comes time for the accreditation reporting or when submitting your details to the rankings and ratings institutions, that there is quality to be measured there, that there have been opportunities for professional development, that we have connected with research in the space and created opportunity there. Particularly with the recent shift away from the SIP reports being just those PDFs that live on our website and live in your lobby, we do want to see more of an institutional dialogue and being able to pull out the quality findings from SIP and from Commons to make a more shared learning experience, because we do know, Sophie, you and I reading the SIP reports know how much good work is there. And then when institutions go to report for themselves, that work is brought up into the light, but it could be more prevalent in the conversations that we have with the signatories. So that's just one area of content development for the future, is building up the commons and building up the SIP narratives so that people feel comfortable and confident sharing on practice, on their classroom and their research, et cetera, to paint the whole picture of what's going on at an institution, not just that they're Prime members or signatories.
Yeah, absolutely. And Matt too, and Andrew, as we go here, feel free to jump in if you kind of have immediate or gut reactions to anything that's said. And I appreciate that too. Yeah, please, Andrew.
I was just going to say, and picking up on Meredith's point. I mean, I agree. I think metrics have a value. The most powerful metrics, obviously, do help motivate, inspire, and measure best practice. Certainly, what we try to do with rankings is not to sort of impose, additional bureaucratic and resource-intensive burdens that are just for the sake of rankings. I mean, I think our hope is, to try to leverage either existing metrics or encourage the use of other metrics that would be more generally valuable across business schools and universities. So we're then hopefully able to distill some of the things out of that wider system that has broader value. If you take something like research, for example, we're interested obviously in trying to see, what proportion of academic research has a resonance with the world of practice and focuses on societal needs. And we're not trying to therefore impose a whole series of additional data collection exercises just for the sake of our rankings. One would hope that the academic enterprise more generally, deans of research, individual academics, would want to do research that has impact in these areas, and as part of that process would therefore want to have some simple systems to track that for the wider good. And so rather than trying to impose extra bureaucratic burdens for a narrow purpose, I think we're trying to leverage and encourage and reuse, redeploy, if you like, some of the existing stuff that hopefully good practice would point towards.
Well, and I'll build on that by kind of confirming that, I guess, in that the sorts of things that we are now, the numbers we're gathering for our FT reporting are pretty similar to things that we were gathering anyway before the FT started asking those questions. Not identical, so we've tweaked it a little bit, but similar, because we were interested in trying to change things anyway, and we were counting those things in order to help our conversations internally. But the fact that now they have a value through the rankings process as well has helped. But it doesn't feel like additional work. It was something we were doing anyway.
No, that's good to hear. And obviously we can perhaps go into more detail on some of the specific measures, but another one in that space beyond research, of course, is what we've tried to do is to look at the operations of business schools. So notably, is there actually a net zero target for emissions? And is there at the very least a regular audit of emissions and carbon auditing? So again, this is not simply hopefully for our narrow purposes, but it should make sense for business schools and universities to be doing this anyway if they are walking the talk of tackling sustainability issues. And so therefore, hopefully it is lifting all boats, as it were, by these sort of efforts to then identify, encourage best practice and benchmarking and incentivize more schools to be doing these things.
Could I ask a question just on that? As the top schools are identified there and made known, is there any sort of community feedback moment, like knowing from the Prime perspective that when we kind of celebrate a case study, then it's presented to the community and it's a shared learning experience, or it's brought to a chapter and then the chapter kind of, again, lifts all boats. Is there, once the identifications have been made and the lists have been announced and all of that, how does it go further into community building? Is that an avenue that's often explored?
No, it's a good question. I mean, I think obviously the rankings themselves can only go so far, but for example, thinking about that carbon audit report, our criteria require that those audits are public in order for them to be credited. And so clearly there's great potential, and we are looking at ourselves, but it should be also open to others to then be exploring all of those different reports and best practices from different schools and creating communities. And interestingly, a few weeks ago, I was talking to a network of European schools that's been created precisely looking at this issue of carbon emissions and how to most effectively and consistently track them. So we are seeing, evidence of communities of practice emerging, both to talk about standards for reporting and how to do those consistently, but also sharing experiences. One thing that came out of that group was actually, on the one hand, there's the concern or debate about scope 3 with pushback from corporates and regulators in that space, but clearly scope 3, i.e. basically travel for students and academics, is easily the largest point of emissions for business schools. And actually, at current carbon prices, the cost of those offsets is actually quite modest compared to the total tuition revenues, for example, that schools are generating. So that sparked something of a debate about, obviously, on the one hand, how to verify the quality of carbon offsets. And some schools have done great work there, for example, at looking at engaging students to explore potential and high quality offset projects that they will then, or the school will then use to do their offsets. So they're integrating directly into learning and student activities alongside academics and faculty, ways to really sort of drive the net zero debate and use the business schools as a sort of sandbox for innovation.
I'd add a bit, actually, just thinking about your question around where do the conversations happen about the outcomes of this sort of work. And actually, the Prime community is one of those places that I'm thinking about. So the Global Forum, but also the meetings that the regional chapters have. And I've been quite involved in the UK chapter over the years, and thinking about the annual conference. And those might be some of the places where people would come together, but the conversations would happen about what's going on with your work around accreditations or with FT rankings. And that's one of the ways I've seen the kind of, in my mind, the interaction between Prime and then the sorts of things that you need to do for accreditors and rankings, is that Prime kind of provides that relationship space and community space to share and learn from each other in relation to the other things. So as I say, I hadn't made the connection that you mentioned earlier, Meredith, about the UN can't do ranking itself. So it's interesting to see the way this sort of ecosystem has developed. Yeah.
Although just to push back on that, some bits of the UN don't do rankings, but others do. There are all sorts of competitiveness indices, and of course there have been debated assessments of health systems around the world. I mean, there are a series of new initiatives in this space. So we shouldn't get obsessed with rankings, but on the other hand, it shouldn't be entirely off the agenda either. I think to have and to encourage consistent reporting of all sorts of data, that whether the UN itself or other entities, including the FT or third parties, then choose to distill and interpret in different ways that can be very valuable. They're sensitive, of course, because no one likes to be low down in a ranking, but of course they can also provide very powerful incentives to improve best practice.
absolutely. It's the constant debate too, and the UN ecosystem too is, are we too much carrot and not enough stick, and can we how can we blend the two, and how can we make the community better? And I do think you all three spoke to that, and how and maybe leads into kind of one of my next questions too, on how we can kind of complement each other's work. And while one is truly a ranking, and another is a place to kind of maybe a safe space to really share our challenges, our flaws, but also the opportunities that exist, and sharing good practices in that space. And we are looking to definitely measure through the SIP report in a number of ways. And you mentioned, specifically operations, Andrew, and the focus on practice. And that's we introduced our 7th principle last year too on practice. So it's definitely something we're also emphasizing, like looking at that kind of holistic picture of the institution. So maybe we can dive a little bit more into, and maybe Meredith, I'll start with you, but if you could really specifically speak to where you see the biggest opportunity for Prime and the Financial Times to align efforts, whether it's through data or storytelling or kind of some shared frameworks.
Yeah, well, from my experience, like how Matt spoke to it there, like you hear these conversations when you're in the Prime ecosystem, and it's a natural fit that these conversations are happening, especially with the Financial Times. Like you go to conference, you go to the EFMD conference, and Andrew's on the stage, like the conversations are happening. So you've got to make sure that the community feels attuned and plugged into these situations. And so when we look to build opportunities, like, I mean, here's a present example that we're sitting here. But the idea that we don't want the activities for Prime to just exist in the Prime vacuum, and that you go to a Prime conference or a Prime Global Forum every couple of years, and that's where you got your kind of fix on the SDGs or something like that, that it becomes more of a process and a conversation and an ongoing dialogue, so that you have learning moments that you can check in with, if it's workshops, if it's certification series, if it's seeing that there's a special issue call or a case opportunity coming up, like the carrot and the stick thing. Not everything will be the same motivator to the same people. So we want to make sure that the motivators and the opportunities that exist in the community are broad enough and also focused enough that they can draw in different individuals from around a business school, different types of professors, different researchers, administrators, etc. So it's, for us, we want to create an ecosystem that is welcoming and inviting to have the hard conversations, and to empower the schools that are doing great, and to bring those along that maybe do need a little bit more love. So making sure that it's a safe space to have those conversations and to have those connections, and then to leave it to the community to also take the reins and build their own leadership, because that's kind of what business schools are best at, really, too.
And maybe I'll bounce that question back to you, Matt, and then to you, Andrew, as well, on where you see the biggest opportunity for Prime and Financial Times to maybe align efforts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about what we've already said and what to add. And, I'm agreeing, Meredith, with everything you've been saying. And I think, so like I said before, I see, there's the places where you have to report things like the rankings and like accreditation, but there's all the work that goes into not just gathering that data, but doing the work in the first place so that there is some useful data to gather, and how does that all get shaped? And it is through conversations that happen in places that Prime helps create, but also others too. And you mentioned, the EFMD conference, and we hosted the EFMD Americas conference last year, and I was helping shape that, and creating spaces on that agenda. The conversation's happening in lots of different places, not just at Prime, but there is an ecosystem, and there's connections between all of that's happening, and I think, Meredith, your point about creating opportunities to bring more and more different people from institutions into those conversations really helps. So I remember in the early days, there would be a Prime representative from schools, and they'd be the person that would go to the Prime event. But now more and more, the more you can get lots of different people involved and learning from each other, because my favorite bit of any Prime event is where you're sitting around a table talking to 5 or 6 people from all corners of the world that you've never met before, and sharing similarities and differences in what you're trying to do in your institution and what's going on. So there's the places for the sharing and learning that helps develop good quality stuff that could get reported to the FT and the accreditors. But then there's something reciprocal in that around also gathering what are people's experiences with, the way the FT phrases the questions, for example, or the way what exactly the accreditors ask about and don't ask about, and what's helpful in the way these things get constructed, but also they're all constructed with good intentions, but then there's bits of tweaking what you want to do as you go along and have some experience. So there's something useful reciprocal as well, where those conversations can happen, and then feedback can be given to the bodies about, well, you could tweak this or you could tweak that, and it might have a better kind of outcome. So.
Yes, so to add to that, I mean, first of all, on the metrics specifically, I think the SIP reports are interesting. I would love to see more and have more discussion about ways in which, as we discussed earlier, some of that data or the presence or absence of a SIP report could be acknowledged in our rankings and others. What that does require is some degree of, consistency in reporting that would allow it to be metricified, if that's a word. So that's on the data side, and I think clearly, those efforts to encourage transparency reporting and therefore sharing of best practice, both quantitative and qualitative, are really valuable and areas of great interest for the FT and its engagement with Prime. But then, as you were saying as well, both of you, I mean, I think that wider discussion and dialogue is really important. I'm always very open and have come to many Prime events and very, happy to continue to do so. For example, in the past, I've picked up from discussions with Prime about some of the work on business and human rights, which has led to articles. Of course, the whole discussion currently here in the US about the pushback by the Trump administration on ESG and DEI is a really important one. And a lot of that goes way beyond anything that we're trying to measure or rank, but feeds into our reporting and our wider reflections. And then I think another area where we have, and I'd like to see deepen the relationship with Prime, is both around our awards, where we're always keen to encourage responsible business education practices that can be highlighted in our annual round, looking, as I said before, both at students, at researchers, and at operational issues around business schools. So the more we can both bring in submissions from around the world and not just, kind of some of the usual suspect schools, as it were, in richer countries, the better. And then to be able to disseminate those award winners through the Prime networks, amongst others. And then the other area that I touched on briefly at the start, I've been doing a lot recently around how we can help provide content and resources that can be used directly in learning. So both mini case studies that we've been producing recently in partnership with business school professors, not least looking at issues around sustainability. We've got a whole series of these sort of 800-word, roughly, articles, but that are framed as a case with a dilemma to trigger classroom discussion. And then separately, we launched recently a series that we call Professor's Picks, where we're trying to simply get faculty as the experts in the classroom if they identify a relevant topical media article, and then they can add a few questions and discussions. Again, we share that weekly on our site. And so both getting submissions for both the cases and the picks, and then trying to find ways to share that content to get it used and debated is hopefully also a valuable way to build that sort of partnership with Prime and some of these wider networks engaged in really interesting work around sustainability.
Thanks, Andrew. Meredith, did you want to add to that?
No, I just had a question because I wasn't familiar with that. Did you say is it focus almost like a global classroom model then, where if it runs weekly, people can connect it to their class, or is it something that people do individually?
So, I mean, essentially, the model for the Professor's Picks, and I can put the link into the chat here, is, because you do unfortunately have to be an FT subscriber, but many are, but Business School Picks is literally a professor anywhere from business school will identify an article, probably ideally something that's been reported in the previous few days, so it's very fresh and topical, and then we'll frame it with a few questions. And the ideal workflow, if you like, I'd like to see is that the professor might pick that and then themselves assign that the question in the article in their next class. and then encourage the sort of the onwards dialogue by getting their students to react to it, and indeed even to comment beneath the article that we published. And that allows a kind of, good, healthy, broad debate on the issues in discussion, but also gives some recognition to the students within the FT, if you like. So, for example, this Sunday, we just published the latest one, and it began with an article by Tensi Whelan from NYU Stern, with actually two op-ed pieces with opposing views on whether ESG is the future or ESG is finished, both of which had been written by colleagues of hers. And so again, really trying to sort of provoke that debate and reflection and discussion by students and create a sort of positive cycle of debate and engagement. The second series, which again I'll put the link in B School Case, is slightly longer, but as I say, sort of 800 words, written, framed by a professor, normally leveraging FT and other content of topical issues, but again with the idea that this could complement, or in some cases even substitute for perhaps slightly older, well-established and longer, more classic business school cases, but to make them fresh and up to date and topical. So those are two areas, and we're also actually in the process of launching something still more ambitious that we can talk about and certainly share details of as that comes together. But we're planning both a webinar series and then some sort of asynchronous supporting materials to go with it around business and nature and biodiversity. So looking at best practices, looking at the context politically, but also the regulatory and reporting environment and what businesses can do, even in these more complex and challenging political times, to engage not just around carbon emissions, for example, or climate change, but also specifically biodiversity as this wider existential issue for our planet going forwards. So lots of opportunities in that learning space, I think, that will be expanding in the months ahead.
Excellent. Thanks so much for sharing, Andrew. And we'll be sure to also share those links for those in the audience too. We'll make sure to share those again after as well, in case they're not coming through. And just while we're here too, if you have questions, feel free to use that Q&A function. It looks like the chat function isn't working for everyone. So just make sure that you use that Q&A if you would like to request questions to the panelists. Maybe I'll just pivot quickly in the meantime to looking more at some challenges too that we're experiencing. So we talked a little bit about the opportunities, but I wonder, and maybe Matt, I'll get your perspective kind of from your position, and then Andrew, maybe what you're hearing from the community that you're working with. And so I just want to know kind of what common challenges do institutions, kind of your peer group, let's say, face when aligning internal structures, curricula, or maybe it's operations to reflect FT's focus on this kind of renewed focus, let's say, on positive societal outcomes. What kind of challenges are there? Something that came up in previous episodes too was not so much about it's not that we're not doing enough, it's that we're having trouble actually communicating or telling the story of what we're doing. So I wonder what challenges you all experience. So Matt, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. And I think that's quite a neat distinction to draw between the challenges around doing the work and then the challenges around getting the right sort of data and numbers and everything you need to tell that story. We've been involved for a long time in thinking about how we strengthen the integration of ESG, sustainability, SDGs kinds of topics across the curriculum, and I think there's quite a few different things that have come up around what makes that tricky and challenging. That I think, from talking to colleagues in other institutions, it's pretty common across a lot of institutions. There is, I guess I tend to find most faculty colleagues are pretty enthusiastic about the agenda and supportive, which is something that's changed. Been involved in this conversation for quite a long time. It was sometimes a more robust conversation, maybe kind of 15, 20 years ago. The world has changed, and find a lot of very supportive, enthusiastic colleagues. So then there's challenges around, inertia, and it's obviously always easier to turn up and teach more or less what you taught last year, and the effort involved in creating something new the time, how do you create that time for people, and that can get you into the way contracts are structured and how people get paid. But then also confidence, and people might be, if you're working with someone, a marketing specialist, finance specialist, strategy, they're interested, but and they can go away and do some work and think about how they could bring new material into their curricula, but they feel like, well, but there's these sustainability people who over here have been doing this for years. Who am I to try and talk about these topics? So there's how you help support people to feel confident to do this sort of thing. There's one or two colleagues who I guess I'd say still remain ideologically opposed, perhaps, to this sort of thing, but not many of those characters around so much anymore, I'd say. And then there's a whole set of challenges around how you gather good data to tell that story. I have a lot of conversations. There's various things we do. So we do two things primarily. We review all the materials, all the teaching materials. So there's people in the central team, a team of us who go through all the teaching materials on all the courses, looking for the content that has something to do with ESG, sustainability, the SDGs. And then we also invite faculty colleagues to self-report on what they're doing, and then match those two data sets to make sure it's kind of broadly similar. And sometimes the sort of content is very visible, but often, you can't really see very much in the teaching materials, but you have a conversation with a faculty member and they're like, well, we did this thing, and it kind of, we had a really good 2-3 hour conversation with all these exercises, but there wasn't really much written down. So there's not a visible paper trail that you can show an auditor that, or someone who wants to know that you really did it, that it's there. And, Andrew, you spoke earlier around metrification and wanting to find things that are easily countable. And, I think the question at the core of the FT about what's your total teaching hours and what proportion of that do you spend on ESG is a really good way of trying to metrify, but still kind of, well, was it 30 minutes? Was it 45 minutes? Was it, you get into those sorts of things that are you have to make your best judgment. And also, well, is that ESG? Is it not ESG? We kind of find ourselves in those conversations from time to time as well. Yeah, and I also, I'm talking here about, the questions around curriculum, but you've mentioned sort of questions around net zero and carbon footprint. I think what we found straightforward has been relatively straightforward, has been the process of creating a carbon footprint and doing those kinds of calculations and seeing the different, the shape of what's contributing to what. We've made quite a focus on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, looking at the heating systems on the campuses in particular as something, there are technological solutions there that can be adopted. It just needs capital investment. And so I guess one of the biggest challenges has been, okay, we've figured out what we need to do to get to net zero on scope 1, but it's quite expensive. And where do we find that cash? But yeah, you're right. Then thinking about the air travel question, which is interesting, we thought it would be, particularly for a global school, mainly international students, and a model where you rotate between campuses. And air travel is a big chunk of our carbon footprint, but and very difficult to deal with compared with heating, but not quite as big as we thought it would be.
Shall I come in? So first of all, going back to the topic of measuring societal impact, I think it is incredibly complex, of course. And that's one reason why, although we're talking in part here about rankings, I placed a lot of emphasis on the fact that we shouldn't just think about rankings. That's part of a package, but a lot of what we do is broader reporting. And then, as I mentioned, for example, the awards that we do. And I think the awards are a perfect sort of place to, if you like, report a bit more descriptively on initiatives that have impact. I do think data should be part of that. Can you measure what your reach has been on a particular societal project, for example? But, the challenge then is it can be much more complex to sort of compare, how do you compare a sort of public health project in Malawi with a community outreach product around prisoner rehabilitation in Chicago, for example? It's sort of meaningless, obviously, because they're all very highly worthwhile. So I think, metrics there have a key role to play in assessing at the individual level of the project, but it would be much more complex to try to sort of distill and compare those in some aggregated way for a ranking. So for me, those are the sorts of areas that fit much more comfortably into wider awards and reporting. That said, I think, if one could start to say, well, X% of the faculty or Y% of students in this or that course or school are engaged in some form of, let's say, societal impact work, that's an interesting measure that could perhaps be integrated. And I think it would be good to talk about some of the SIP metrics as perhaps part of that package, if you like. So that's on the sort of the metrics side. And Matt was talking about learning the curriculum. I mean, in some ways, that's the most complicated, of course, because as you say, there can be such a difference in the depth or the commitment or the impact of what's looked at. I mean, hours of a share of total for core versus elective is interesting. I'm quite interested in whether learning outcomes, or indeed, I'm looking at a couple of ways to analyze this at the moment, but even if there was a way using AI to actually try to assess, the full range of course content, reading lists, notes, and so on, could be a way forward. That requires various sort of challenges, obviously, including sensitivities about individual courses, but I think would be an interesting area to explore going forwards.
Did you want to add anything there before we move on?
No, as we are also grappling with the curriculum question ourselves, especially, I mean, Matt mentioned earlier, like moving from the single point of contact of the prime individual within the institution to wanting it to be more of a community and more people within the schools. And with that comes experts. Everybody's got their accounting department, everybody's got their marketing department. And so we live in our business school silo, but we understand that the communities within those silos have some repetition there. So the curriculum question is one that we tossed around a lot, especially when we had the Impactful 5 running. It's in its final year now, but when we were beginning the pedagogical side of things and trying to kind of help teachers up their confidence for creativity and criticality in the classroom, it did come back to curriculum oftentimes, and feeling equipped or feeling like you had the resources that were there to challenge the students if you yourself lacked a confidence in a specific lens, that it wasn't necessarily a place you wanted to go to yourself. So it's something that we've seen the vulnerabilities around, and we've been working to kind of fill that gap. And I think Commons is useful because it at least gives a space for the conversation in a less than once a year sort of way. So frequency and checking in with one another and things like that. But I would have thought that for Prime, and Sophie, you know this, it's your work, is we often ask ourselves, all right, how is this reaching the universities? How is this reaching the business schools? But then like leave it to our imagination of how it is reaching the students, and wanting to be a lot more specific in the scope of the reach towards the final output being the students and the student skills is something that's come up for not just Prime, but for so many organizations in the last few years. Maybe just to praise Andrew for a second, that idea of the students being able to weigh in on the recent articles through like the example that you gave of the NYU Stern School, where it's op-eds written from two people at the same school being debated by someone, I could teach the Cadbury case study and it would go be living in a textbook, but you could go teach that as a case study and you could take it to an interview and talk about something that happened last week. And that's really doing the students the favor of empowering them with relevant skills, because you're empowering them with relevant resources and conversations. And that's something that we know we need more of in the community, and we want to help to create the opportunity for access and for like the cutting edge kind of conversations, because we don't want the sustainable development goals to just be the framework that we're living in. We want to make sure that the conversation stays edgy and stays skills oriented.
Yeah, I just picking up on Meredith's very good point there. I mean, I think, on the one hand, there's a challenge that I hear often, which is bluntly, it's getting more and more difficult to get students to read. And yet clearly, when they're going out for internships or jobs and so on, to be able to demonstrate both a knowledge and a curiosity is really important. And therefore, clearly, to try to get them to include more, kind of current affairs in their reading diet, and be able to have opportunities to signal and sort of demonstrate that when they're going for interviews or engaging with those beyond the business school is really important, and is something I'm thinking about a lot about, in the whole context of global and media literacy at all levels, including at the secondary and the high school level, where we also have a program offering free access to the FT to try to encourage that. So that's one thing. I mean, just coming back to the point on incentives, I suppose this is one of the wider challenges, I think, isn't it? I mean, first of all, sustainability, responsible education can mean so many different things to so many different people, and perhaps the signals are still quite difficult to tease out or to kind of connect back in a way that might drive reform within the schools, if I can put it that way. So to just be a little controversial, I mean, people criticize the rankings, but I think, the tyranny of bibliometrics, this obsession by academics to publish in peer-reviewed journals, I mean, it accounts for 10% of 3 of our rankings. It would seem, for like 99% of many of the faculty's own self-assessments and the decisions on tenure and promotion, which to me is unhealthy, frankly. I mean, I would like to see schools take a leadership role in saying, yes, X% of our decisions around promotion, hiring, and so on will be based on high quality peer reviewed content, but it should also be based on the nature of the impact that content's trying to have, and it should be about community outreach, and it should be about high quality teaching. And often these other things get a little fall by the wayside. So there's an internal, perhaps, lack of broader incentives. And then the final thing is, to me, is that there's really, which I would love to see more discussion about, there's a lack, frankly, of probably the biggest driver of all an incentive for reform in terms of signals from employers. Because, I think if one thing would really mobilize business schools to change, it would be if recruiters started saying, we actually want to see a distinctive set of skills and values in students that we're coming to recruit, which would have sustainability, responsibility embedded within them. But I have to say, frankly, I don't see a lot of evidence of that. And I've had a lot of discussions with roundtables with recruiters and business schools and so on. And I think the mismatch sometimes between a high level, fine sounding rhetoric at the board level and actually the qualifications that are being looked for by the recruiters themselves within employers are often very different. And I would love to see some sort of, emerging consensus about some areas that the right sort of student, shall we say, could be delivering, and that employers would be preferentially looking for and hiring. But I don't see much evidence so far of that being the case. And I think that's a real block for pushing greater reform in this direction.
Go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
Okay, then you go. Well, only to echo and support, actually, I think all of that. I completely recognise, Andrew, what you're talking about with the tyranny of the peer review journal article and that kind of publishing, and it's another part of the system that we're in that needs influencing and changing. And I'd agree with everything you said, and I guess I'd only add that I think what the FT is doing with the rankings questions is helping. It's making a small but positive contribution in shifting that bigger system, and then also to agree with your observation around recruiters and organisations and what they're asking for, and I would share that observation. And it remains a puzzle to me that you look at the organisations that are the most ambitious and the most well regarded around sustainability in ESG. And still often there seems to be a bit of a disconnect within those organisations between the leadership that they're showing and the conversations that are happening with people who are doing recruiting and generally thinking about skills and capabilities and what's important. It's happening in places, but still not as often as I'd expect. And I guess I could only guess that, as with all of us, you've only got a certain amount of bandwidth and energy and time, and those organisations are trying to do so much around sustainability, and having the conversations with the recruiters' colleagues internally is quite a long way down the list, and sometimes doesn't always happen. But it would be really useful for that to show up more strongly in conversations.
You've kind of touched on the question I wanted to ask as well, so maybe the question to both of you. And Sophie, I know we're tight on time, so I'll try to keep it short. Have the skills changed? The recruiters are coming and saying that, okay, these are the skills that we're looking for. Are they the same skills that you were seeing 10, 15 years ago? Or have the skills developed, just maybe not in the way that we thought they would?
So I'll offer a comment on that. I have colleagues who are very closely involved in those conversations, and I'm not directly involved. So others would speak with more experience than me. I think, from what I am aware of, the sorts of things that are being looked at and called for by recruiters are changing, are evolving. They're not the same as 10 years ago, but things to do with ESG don't feature as strongly in the mix as I might expect.
Jeff, Meredith's got views. I mean, I would bow to the experts in the field, as it were, in terms of recruiters. My only instinct is that I think for decades you've also heard the appetite for so-called soft skills, critical thinking, innovation, communication, teamwork, things like that, which in general I would argue we need better, kind of ways of assessing, actually. And I don't see those. I mean, they're sort of often embedded and implicit, but not necessarily always explicit in, a classic grade or graduation, should we say, or in courses that always emerge. And I think that it's an interesting debate to see, and perhaps it is something for the prime community to discuss, how those wider skills, alongside, obviously, should we say some more technical or focused skills on sustainability specifically, could be fostered and encouraged more widely. I see there's a question, by the way, also from Anne. Don't want to interrupt your flow, but we should come to that perhaps as well.
Yeah, we'll jump into that here in one moment, but just to kind of close here too, it's a really great point too, and it was just I had the same thought, Andrew, too, that we have this, CEO survey that we do at Global Compact every other year. And it's really interesting too, because I also see it as potentially a measuring issue. And I'm not really knowing what we're measuring, because we do see all of these future skills report with those things that you mentioned, those softer skills that are kind of in demand, let's say. But are we measuring what we term ESG skills, or are we measuring those skills that help us deal with ESG problems? So I see that as kind of, a really similar and maybe controversial issue in some ways, or anyway, something that we're not meeting the demand of, for sure. Okay, so yeah, maybe Andrew, if you see the comment here, if you could speak to that, but maybe just for the audience who can't see the question, in case the person has asked, can Andrew speak to the annual research insights and how those may align with Prime and how this may evolve?
Yeah, so just to be clear, so as we discussed earlier, about 10% in 3 of our rankings is given for research, and that's currently at the moment primarily obviously presence in recent years in the so-called FT50 list of highly regarded academic journals. What we've been trying to do, and we're going to go into our second round of that, we'll publish a report towards the end of this year, is trying to capture what I've called, if you like, the 3 R's. So rigor, i.e. high quality and peer reviewed, but also relevant, i.e. aligned with, let's call it the SDGs, and also resonant, i.e. efforts to disseminate ideas into the world of practice. So if those are the sort of 3 buckets, I think, trying to develop and identify metrics that not only capture in different ways the best academic, peer-reviewed, intellectually rigorous research, but looking at ways, for example, through teaching, even case writing, on the one hand, to get, or indeed publishing in practitioner outlets, to get the word out beyond the business school, is really important. And then also trying to capture, if you like, third-party references amongst practitioners of academic insights. So we used in the past, and I think we'll continue to use some of these third-party tools that try to track, for example, references of academic research in government consultation documents or think tank reports, things beyond academia that are sort of helping disseminate ideas into practice. So the idea of this year is still, as we did last year, a kind of standalone, but longer term, going back to this issue of trying to not add to workload, but to encourage data that would be useful to the wider community is to create a sort of once a year stock take that we could both provide standalone, but also integrate into our existing rankings. And that needs some work talking alongside the business schools, and particularly, for example, the deans in charge of research and so on, to see how to align and report, ideally in an open access way, that full range of academic outputs. So getting technical, the use of open access ORCID numbers to identify individual academics, and the use of other data sets, so that we can create a community where anyone can get access to the best research and try to measure and track it through to dissemination. So that's the current plan. And I hope this does provide a way to kind of stimulate a broader debate on and encouraging academics and at the institutional level business schools, and then users of research and insights more widely outside academia to kind of leverage the best research into practice with societal impact.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. And I know we're low on time here, so we do have one more question in the chat that just kind of hops back a little bit to this pressure from employers or recruiters at the private sector, or let's just say, employers in general, on having responsibly minded or sustainably minded employees. I'll kind of paraphrase here just for the audience too. So against the backdrop of the recent contraction of the global investment in ESG projects, how likely is it that practice would become greater proponents of responsible management? And how could we reverse or remedy this? So maybe that's just a kind of a good question to end on here. And maybe you all can, I'll pass it to all three of you to answer that, and maybe kind of add into there some closing remarks. Meredith, maybe I'll start with you if you will. Thank you.
No, I'm just rereading the question here. I think that for me, like the concern that I have is this is the ecosystem that we live in, and for Prime, we have such a global audience, and so it's wanting to make sure that we're fighting against the factors of isolationism and nationalism to really bring the best of the institutions forward, to make sure that the opportunities that I've spoken about are there. But at the end of the day, Prime's a community, and there have been a million metaphors about what Prime is in the past, whether it's a bridge or a platform, et cetera, and you don't just want to be one of those things. You want to be that safe space where these difficult conversations can come forward. So I don't feel like I'm equipped to say what the future looks like. I think I can just comment on the community that we're building today and the opportunities that exist there. And so in that, I would just kind of pause and say, we recognize these challenges, we feel them, we see them in the AACSB language and all of the things like that have seen a shift in our world. But that we aren't recoiling, that we hope to create more opportunities for these conversations to go forward. That's who Prime is in our DNA. We might be slow to say so because we do live within the UN Global Compact, which is a bureaucratic place, and we want to cross our T's and dot our I's before we make statements. But we know who we are, and we hope our community knows who we are as well. So being the space that Prime was always meant to be and being that community is something that we just hold on value to.
Matt, maybe I'll pass it to you.
Yeah. So I think if I heard the question right, the things going on in the world in the last few months and the contraction of ESG and everything that's driving that ESG investing, is that likely to influence whether companies are going to be more proactive proponents or not in calling for these sorts of skills? I think that's the question I heard, and I guess where that takes my mind is some of the ways we've seen companies responding to some of the critique coming from some part of the world of ESG and DEI recently, and some organizations brushing it off and remaining as committed as they ever were and being as outspoken as they ever were. Others feeling the need and the pressure to step back and maybe do a little less than they have in the past, and some kind of in the middle, planning to continue their work, but maybe not speaking so publicly about it and keeping their heads down a bit to avoid attracting attack. And so I guess in that, so I'm seeing that sort of pattern a bit amongst companies, not just in the US, but in lots of different places. And in that context, I could imagine maybe some companies being a little less vocal around the kind of skills they're looking for. even than they have been in the past. We've spoken to them about maybe not being vocal enough. At the same time as others actually seeing this as a case for why they need to be more vocal and call for more investment in education in these areas. So mixed picture, and carry on, hope for the best.
Yeah, challenging.
Look, I mean,
Go ahead, Andrew.
yeah. No, look, I mean, let's be frank about this. I mean, there clearly is a ideologically driven attack in the US, specifically at the moment, on all matters ESG and DEI. It's a very crude and blunt one, and it's driving a lot of organizations to, at the very least, lower the profile and often sort of relabel. But I think, it's interesting to see, if you scratch beneath the surface, a lot of people are still trying to get around the trigger words, but reflect the underlying purpose. We can't deny climate change is taking place, and amongst other things, it's a business issue. We can't deny that, however we want to call it, community building, inclusiveness, diversity of perspective is fundamentally important to reflect the world we're in. And people are having to sort of dance around the terms, particularly in the absence so far of litigation or other pushbacks to clarify what the boundaries are. But I think business schools are in a better position than many, because they can and they should focus on, if you like, the business case and the business approach to these issues. And at the same way, again, companies might be a bit reluctant on the sort of public front at the moment, but I think many of them will recognize and are continuing to recognize the importance of these issues. So it's partly about labeling and positioning, but as we said earlier, it does also still need, I think, much more work to kind of identify if there are certain core skills and values that they need in this space and that business schools and their students can provide. And we need a much more kind of comprehensive and holistic debate around those issues, I think, as the starting point to drive the incentives for positive change.
Thank you. Excellent, and really a realistic kind of picture to end on, but still a hopeful one. And I appreciate all three of you for your time today. Thank you, Meredith, Andrew, Matt, and the audience for being with us today for a fruitful conversation. Thank you also for your questions, and look forward to continuing these really important dialogues. Wishing you a wonderful rest of your day and evening.
Thanks very much. Great to see you all.
Thank you so much. Great
Thank
to
you.
see you all. Bye-bye.